time, didn't it? Well done.
Yes, thank you.
I suppose what I want to add to that is, I don't know if you know this, but Manchester Feminist Network is an unfunded group, and it's frankly amazing that they put this together on really no money at all. So please buy stuff, please buy raffle tickets, please support them so they'll continue and put together these wonderful events for us again in the future. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about today is a bit about the links between the history of the women's movement and ongoing activism. So this is about keeping feminism alive, if you like. I'm going to talk a little bit about where the second wave of the women's movement started in the US, how it started, who started it. And I'm going to take that through the rape crisis movement and on to talk about Trafford rape crisis, which is our new group in South Manchester. Okay, so back in the 1960s, in America, there were a couple of big political struggles going on. There was the civil rights movement, the struggle for rights for black people, and there was also the movement against the Vietnam War. You've heard of those, yeah? Even whoever you are and however young you are, to me they seem like just yesterday, but maybe to you they're prehistory. And in the universities there was an organisation called Students for a Democratic Society, which was young students, mostly middle-class white students, because that was who was at university back then, who organised to get involved in the civil rights movement. But they did a lot of other campaigns as well, and this is an SDS picture from the late 1960s. And these students are on strike at the University of Michigan, and they're striking because they want a student bookshop. Can you imagine not having a student bookshop and having to go on strike? What a bizarre world that must have been, very different to our own. The women who were in SDS began to notice that at the meetings, what would happen was the men would sit down and start discussing, and the women would go and make the coffee. And then I'd drink tea over there. So that's me being international. Yeah, okay. So the women would go and make the coffee, and they started to say, why is it like this? Why do we make the sandwiches? Why do we make the coffee? Why do you have the discussions? And they took this as a motion to a big conference, big student conference in Chicago, and this was discussed in a conference room much bigger than this, with more people, and taken very seriously. And the motion was passed to say that there was going to be gender equality, though they wouldn't have had that language. Equal rights, I suppose, in Students for a Democratic Society. And after the motion had been passed, everything continued. Do you want to guess? Just as before. Exactly as before. And so the women started to realise that if they wanted to talk about these issues and start to do something about these issues, they needed women-only space. And that's where the concept of women-only space comes from. It's not about excluding anybody. It's not about being negative. It's actually about making a positive space for women, for us to talk about our experiences in our lives and our shared experiences and across our differences. And that's what it was about from the very early days. So the women in SDS started to create women-only groups, and they started to organise actions, demos. And one of the very early ones they did was this one, at the Miss America pageant in Atlantic City in 1968. Now, the dominant form of public action right then, apart from things like the marches for the civil rights movement, was for young men to burn their draft cards. So do you understand that? Young men who'd been called to go and fight in Vietnam to very bravely take the card which demanded them to go and sign up to be in the army, and take that and publicly burn it as a protest against the war in Vietnam, breaking the law in the process. Yeah, so, you know, a brave form of public protest. So burning a draft card was the dominant form. What these women decided to do instead was to have what they call a freedom trash can. I don't know if you can see that on the side at the front there. And in the freedom trash can, outside the Miss America pageant, they dropped high-heeled shoes, lipstick, push-up bras. I don't know if we have push-up bras. Anyway, bras. I think we haven't got that far yet. Nylons, as they'd call them over there, stockings, yes, and so on and so forth. And this was, you know, symbol of rejecting the patriarchy, rejecting patriarchal values of what a woman was, and emancipating ourselves, becoming free. A journalist came along, reported on the event, and put in the newspaper that women burned their bras. And so if you've ever heard it said that women burned their bras, that's where it comes from. And the women who were at the demo say they didn't at all. That actually it's just one of those bits of media hype. And you've seen that happening in your life, haven't you? You've seen media hype, so you know how that it goes back. Okay, so out of this concept then of women-only space, amazing public demonstrations like this, occupying the offices of Playboy magazine, going and sitting on the floor, Gandhi style, in the offices and just being there, things like that. Women came up with the concept of consciousness raising. Consciousness raising groups were the most dominant form of meeting at that point in the early days of the women's liberation movement. Started in America, very quickly came over here though as well. Lots and lots of older feminists were in consciousness raising groups back in the early 70s over here. And Lisa Tuttle, writing in the 80s, describes it as the most important educational process, a method of group discussion which came out of what they called rap sessions from the radical women in New York in the 1960s. It created an understanding that the person is political. So this is women getting together to talk about themselves, their lives, why they always take the trash out, why they always clean the toilet, who does childcare, what it feels like to always be the one who does childcare, what it feels like to live as a woman, what it feels like to wear high-heeled shoes, whatever it was. And out of those personal experiences, developing a politics. And I don't know if you've ever thought about that, but that's what's unique about feminism. It comes from the ground up. Most theories come from some chap like Karl Marx having an idea and telling the rest of us what we're going to do. Feminism doesn't. It comes from the bottom up. It comes from our lives and creates theory from there. And it does that through consciousness raising. So back then, the Red Stockings group, for example, would meet every week. It became so large it had to split into more than one group because it was just too big. You might be talking about your experiences of being hassled in the street maybe this week. There might be a topic. Everybody would have a space to speak. They were running in a very democratic fashion to make sure everybody said what they needed to say about that topic. And then there would be some discussion and maybe that would lead to an action. And one of these meetings, or during these meetings, women began to realise that rape wasn't this rare thing that it had always been understood to be. So one of the amazing things that came out of the second wave of the women's movement in the United States, back then in the late 70s, late 60s, early 70s, was the beginning of the awareness of the reality of rape, the truth about rape. And in 1971 in New York, the first ever Speak Out was held. So this was a form of political action. In a room like this, 300 women attended, and women stood up and talked about their experiences of being raped publicly for the first time. It was apparently an incredibly powerful and moving meeting, very strong, very political. A year later, in Washington, D.C., out of those kinds of actions, the first Rape Crisis Centre was set up. The first Rape Crisis Centre was in a woman's home. She had a bed in the corridor, so if somebody needed to stay the night, they could come and stay the night. Shortly after that, Diana Russell started doing research, asking students in California whether they'd experienced rape. So that's the beginning of social research into the reality of rape. All this is all at the beginning of the 1970s, all coming out of these tiny discussions. In Trafford Rape Crisis, we set Trafford Rape Crisis up just about 2 years ago now. We were just getting it started about 2 years ago. And there are 4 of us here today so far from Trafford Rape Crisis. Some of us are quite new to this kind of work. Some of us have been rattling on about rape, I bet you can't get through, for quite a long time now. And so this picture isn't the first speak out. This picture is actually us on the steps of the town hall in Manchester back in the early 1990s. And at the top underneath the placard, that's my hat. But tragically, my face appears to have become wiped out, so you get missed. You missed it. However, what we're doing in Trafford Rape Crisis is trying to do support work, but twin it with activism. Very, very much twin it with activism. And that's why we're here today. That's why we're trying to support Manchester Feminist Network. That's just some of the activism we've done so far. Soraya speaking at our launch, some of us with our banner when we took part in Million Women Rise, and women preparing at the bottom for our Black Feminist Theory conference, which perhaps some of you came to. We've got another event on the 21st of June. We've got a stall out there and we've got sign-up sheets for this. You are all invited, so if you can come to this, do. Sign a sheet and leave it with us if you want to, or take it away to register. On the stall we've also got these, which are toilet door stickers. I just had to explain to someone what a toilet door sticker is, so just, you know, for clarity's sake, they're to put on the inside of women's toilet doors so that women know how to contact Trafford Rape Crisis. So if you fancy a bit of fairly easy activism afterwards, please take some toilet door stickers for us. Okay, I think I've run out of time, but thank you so much for listening. And if you want to know more about what I've been talking about, there are some sources. There's also copies of these slides out there if you want to take that list of references away. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy the workshops, change the world. Thank you.